fog drifts through the neon haze of lower Manhattan. The city hums, indifferent, restless, eternal. Somewhere beneath its surface, where whispers echo louder than truth, the name Lucky Luciano still lingers like cigarette smoke in an empty bar. He was the man who gave the American Mafia a blueprint, who transformed scattered street gangs into a corporate empire of organized crime. But behind the polished myth, behind the neatly packaged stories of power, betrayal, and blood, there were other deals, forgotten agreements buried deep within the shadows of history. The kind of deals that shaped not only the underworld but perhaps even the nation itself. This is not just a story about a gangster. It's a story about America, about power built on secrets and loyalty traded for survival. Luciano's world was one where morality bent to profit, where violence masqueraded as order, and where a man could be both a criminal and a patriot. He lived in the narrow gap between those identities, mastering both until they became indistinguishable. To understand the man, we must first understand his contradictions. He was ruthless but visionary, cruel yet calculated. He could smile as he ordered a death, charm as he plotted domination. Luciano didn't invent organized crime, he organized it, shaped it, and in doing so, created a system so efficient, so invisible, that it mirrored the very capitalism it defied. The 1930s underworld wasn't ruled by brute strength anymore. It was ruled by negotiation. Luciano realized that the new America wasn't built with fists but with deals. Deals that stretched from the alleys of Little Italy to the boardrooms of legitimate business, to the corridors of political power. And among them, some remained unrecorded, whispered agreements that would never make it into trial transcripts or government archives. But the question remains, why did these deals vanish from history? Who benefited from forgetting them? And how did a man like Lucky Luciano, a deported criminal and exiled don, come to be quietly entangled with some of America's most powerful institutions during its most fragile years? The truth is tangled in myth. To the public, Luciano was the suave face of vice, a devil in a tailored suit. To his associates, he was a tactician, a man who turned loyalty into leverage. And to the government, at least for a moment in time, he was something else entirely, a necessary evil, a ghost they'd rather not name. As the voice of history fades, the cracks begin to show. A pattern emerges, in court records, military reports, declassified documents. The Mafia's invisible war, the so-called wartime pacts, the suspicious leniency in sentencing, threads of a hidden network that suggest Luciano's influence didn't end with his imprisonment. It simply changed form. This documentary begins where the official narrative stops, in the gray spaces between fact and fiction. Through those forgotten deals, we glimpse a darker America, one that relied on its criminals when its institutions trembled. A world where law and crime, government and mafia, stood on the same side of the table when it mattered most. Lucky Luciano once said, "There's no such thing as good money or bad money. There's just money." But the truth, his truth, was even simpler. There's no clean power. Every empire, legitimate or not, runs on a deal that someone wants buried. So as we trace his rise from the tenements of New York to the shadows of international politics, remember, this isn't a legend being told. It's an excavation. A descent into the silence that followed his footsteps. Because when the lights go out and the city sleeps, the ghosts of those forgotten deals still whisper in the dark. In the early years of the 20th century, America was a nation in transition, a land of promise and peril colliding in the same narrow streets. New York City was its beating, chaotic heart. Beneath the skyline of ambition, beneath the steam and soot of factories, a different kind of empire was being born, one not written in laws but in fear. Before Lucky Luciano, the criminal world of America was a brutal patchwork of tribes, unrefined, disorganized, and violently territorial. Italian immigrants had brought with them pieces of the old Sicilian underworld, honor codes, blood feuds, and a belief that silence was survival. But in America, those old-world rules collided with a new-world hunger. The Mafia was not yet the sleek machine it would become. It was a street brawl with structure, chaotic, personal, and bound to collapse under its own ambition. In the tenements of Mulberry Street and the backrooms of Brooklyn bars, power belonged to whoever could hold it the longest. Each borough was ruled by a different gang, often bound by ethnicity. The Irish controlled the docks, the Jews the garment rackets, and the Italians fought over what was left. Every deal was temporary, every piece a pause between wars. These early mobsters weren't businessmen, they were survivors. They trusted no one, not even their own kin. The so-called mustache Petes, the old Sicilian bosses who dominated the Italian underworld, clung to the traditions of their homeland. They refused to work with non-Italians, despised innovation, and enforced loyalty through brutality rather than respect. Their power was absolute, but their vision was small. They saw America not as a land of opportunity but as a new territory to exploit under old rules. And in that stubbornness lay their downfall. At the same time, Prohibition was reshaping the landscape of crime. The 18th Amendment, a law meant to cleanse America, did the opposite. It created a black market that turned gangsters into millionaires overnight. Booze flowed through hidden pipelines from Canadian distilleries to New York speakeasies, guarded by the same men who were once street thugs. The underground economy was booming, and yet it was fractured. Every shipment sparked a turf war. Every alliance ended in betrayal. Into this chaos stepped the new generation, men like Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Frank Costello, and a young Charles "Lucky" Luciano. They watched the bloodshed of their mentors with both fascination and disgust. They saw the opportunity the old men couldn't, that crime could be organized, structured like a business, scalable like industry. Where the mustache Petes ruled with superstition and revenge, this new breed thought in numbers and systems. They were fluent in both violence and negotiation, loyal not to bloodlines but to profit. New York in those years was more than a city, it was a living organism of corruption. Police captains took bribes from every gang. Judges were bought like stock. Politicians turned a blind eye as long as the right envelopes were passed. The system didn't fight crime, it fed on it. For a man with vision, this wasn't an obstacle, it was an opportunity. Luciano understood that before anyone else. But to see what Luciano would later build, one must first feel the texture of that world, the dirt under the fingernails of ambition. Picture the flicker of gas lamps over cobblestone streets, where men whispered in dialects about debts and revenge. Hear the music of immigrant despair mixing with the clatter of streetcars, and beneath it, the heartbeat of a new criminal order waiting to emerge. Power in the early underworld was transactional but temporary. A boss's reign lasted only as long as his luck, or his bullets. When one fell, another took his place, and the cycle continued, feeding off blood and greed. The Italians killed the Italians. The Jews warred with the Irish. And through it all, the city, vast, indifferent, immortal, kept swallowing the bodies. This was the America before Lucky Luciano, a land with all the ingredients of empire but none of the structure. A marketplace without management. A criminal gold rush. There was money, yes, mountains of it, but no order, no vision, no leadership that could bind these wild forces into something sustainable. The old world gangsters mistook brutality for control. Luciano saw what they didn't, that real power came not from killing rivals but from coordinating them. The chaos of the 1910s and early 1920s was the crucible that shaped him. It taught him the futility of tradition and the value of efficiency. Watching the old bosses fight over scraps while the police lined their pockets was his first education in modern crime. He didn't want to be just another gangster. He wanted to be something else entirely, the man who could unify this chaos, impose structure on greed, and make crime function like capitalism itself. Before him, the Mafia was a family business. After him, it would become an industry. And as America industrialized its factories, Luciano would industrialize its vices. The Roaring Twenties had given birth to modern America, and to the man who would give birth to modern crime. The city was ready for a leader who could see beyond the next gunfight. The underworld was waiting for its CEO. The streets had built the world he would soon control. But they had also shown him its fatal flaw. There was no honor in tradition, no profit in chaos. Only organization, cold, efficient, ruthless, could turn the shadows into an empire. And soon, Lucky Luciano would do exactly that. The boy who would become the architect of the American Mafia was born far from the neon lights of New York, in the dusty Sicilian town of Lercara Fritti, 1897. His name was Salvatore Lucania. His father was a sulfur miner, hardened by labor, and his mother a devout woman who prayed more than she spoke. Poverty wasn't just a condition, it was the air they breathed. When the family immigrated to the United States in 1906, they joined the great tide of Southern Italians chasing the American dream, but what awaited them on the other side of the Atlantic was not a dream. It was survival. The Lucanias settled in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a neighborhood teeming with life, vice, and desperation. The streets were crowded with pushcarts, sweatshops, and children, thousands of them like Charlie who learned early that no one gave you anything for free. The police didn't protect you. The system didn't care. If you wanted to eat, you fought for it. If you wanted respect, you took it. It was in those alleys that Salvatore became Charlie Lucky, a name that would one day strike fear and awe across continents. But back then, Lucky, was just another hustler trying not to get swallowed by the city. He ran errands, sold protection to smaller kids at school, and learned the economy of fear before he could read a contract. Luck, as he would later joke, had little to do with it. It was survival disguised as charm. His education came not from classrooms but from the sidewalks. At night, he watched men like Arnold Rothstein, the gambler and financier who fixed the 1919 World Series, glide through the city with silk suits and quiet power. Rothstein wasn't a street thug. He was something different, something elegant. He ran his crimes like a corporation. For young Charlie, that was revelation. Violence could make you feared, but organization could make you immortal. By his late teens, Luciano had already assembled a small gang, working petty rackets, running numbers, selling bootleg whiskey, smuggling goods. But what set him apart wasn't his toughness, it was his adaptability. He mingled easily with Jews, Irishmen, and anyone who could make a dollar. In a time when ethnic boundaries defined the underworld, this was heresy. The old Sicilian bosses despised it. Luciano didn't care. He saw what they didn't. That prophet didn't care about ethnicity, only efficiency. Then came Meyer Lansky. Their first meeting was almost cinematic. A chance encounter on the streets when Luciano tried to extort Lansky's craps game. Lansky, slight and quiet, refused to pay. Instead of a beating, Luciano found something unexpected: respect. Lansky's calm intelligence intrigued him. The two formed an unlikely friendship, the son of Jewish immigrants and the Sicilian street brawler, that would evolve into one of the most powerful alliances in American crime. Together they began to imagine a new kind of underworld, one ruled not by emotion but by calculation. Their circle soon expanded to include Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, volatile, handsome, and dangerously unpredictable, the perfect balance to Luciano's cold precision. Then came Frank Costello, the smooth talker with political connections, and Vito Genovese, ruthless and loyal only to ambition. Together they were the architects of a revolution that the old bosses could neither understand nor stop. But Luciano's rise wasn't without scars. In 1929 he learned firsthand the cost of power when he was kidnapped, beaten, and left for dead on Staten Island. The story varies. Some say it was rivals, others say corrupt cops. But what's certain is that Luciano survived when he shouldn't have. His face was permanently scarred, his body broken, but his mind sharper than ever. From that day his nickname Lucky took on new meaning. It wasn't about chance, it was about resilience. He had walked through death and come out colder. This transformation marked the beginning of his ascent. Prohibition had turned New York into a gold mine, and Luciano intended to run it like a monopoly. While others fought over territory, he built networks. He didn't just sell alcohol, he built an infrastructure for it. Supply chains, protection schemes, political payoffs. Everything had a price, and Luciano understood the economy of corruption better than anyone. Still, his ambition went beyond the bootlegging boom. He began studying the systems of legitimate business. How corporations expanded, how they delegated, how they created hierarchies that ensured control without exposure. What if crime could work the same way? What if the Mafia could become a multinational enterprise, invisible yet omnipresent, united under one code and one vision? Luciano's early 20s were marked by experimentation. Testing loyalties, forming silent partnerships, watching how power reacted when you pulled the right strings. He was still under the shadow of the mustache Petes, men like Joe the Boss Masuria, who believed Luciano should serve, not innovate. Luciano played along, pretending loyalty while slowly mapping out how to dismantle the old order from within. His psychological evolution during these years is key to understanding the man he would become. Luciano was not a sadist. He had no joy in violence. For him, violence was a tool, not a language. He understood people, what they wanted, what they feared, and how to buy both. His charisma was disarming, his presence magnetic. To some he was a friend, to others, a mirror reflecting their own greed. The Lower East Side had produced countless gangsters, but only one visionary. Luciano's genius wasn't in the crimes he committed, it was in how he organized them. He turned vice into economy, fear into currency, and loyalty into leverage. He wasn't satisfied being another name in a police ledger. He wanted legacy, something permanent, something structural. By the late 1920s, the street kid from Lercrafritti had become a player in a city of predators. His hands were in everything: gambling, narcotics, bootlegging, and politics. But he was still restless, still waiting for the moment to move against the old world and claim his own. New York was ready to change, and so was he. The streets that had once taught him how to survive would soon become his empire. And in that transformation, From immigrant boy to criminal statesman, the blueprint of the modern mafia was born. The rise of Charlie Lucky was not a story of chance. It was the birth of control in a world built on chaos. He had learned every lesson the hard way, that trust was an illusion, that loyalty could be bought, and that the real game was not survival, but dominance. And as the Prohibition years burned hotter, the world was about to learn what happened when Lucky Luciano decided it was time to rule. By the dawn of the 1930s, the streets of New York were a battlefield wrapped in smoke, blood, and betrayal. The city's underworld was divided between two worlds, the old and the new. On one side stood the mustache Petes, men who ruled through fear, tradition, and superstition. On the other stood a younger generation, ambitious, educated by the streets, and hungry for something bigger than survival. At the center of this collision was Charles Lucky Luciano, the man who would destroy the old order and build a new empire from its ashes. For decades, the Mafia had been guided by ancient Sicilian principles. Leadership passed through bloodlines. Loyalty was bound to birthplace, not competence. The old bosses, men like Joe, the boss Masuria, and Salvatore Maranzano, believed the Mafia's strength came from its rituals, its secrecy, its refusal to change. But to Luciano, those traditions were a prison. America wasn't Sicily. It was a machine, modern, ruthless, industrial. And to survive here, the Mafia needed to evolve. Joe Masuria was the first to test Luciano's patience. Known as Joe the Boss, he ruled with a heavy hand and a short vision. His empire thrived on extortion and protection rackets, squeezing small businesses for scraps. To Masuria, Luciano was just another ambitious soldier, useful but expendable. Yet Luciano saw through him. He admired Masuria's cunning but despised his limitations. Underneath his polite deference, Luciano was already plotting his replacement. Meanwhile, another force was rising, Salvatore Maranzano, a rival Sicilian boss from Castellamare del Golfo. Maranzano was intelligent, calculating, and equally bound to old traditions. He envisioned himself as the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. His arrival ignited what would become known as the Castellamarese War, a bloody power struggle between the old guard factions that would claim dozens of lives and reshape organized crime forever. For Luciano, this was more than a gang war. It was an opportunity. As Masuria and Maranzano fought over control, Luciano positioned himself between them, playing both sides like a chess master. Outwardly, he served Masuria. Secretly, he negotiated with Maranzano. His loyalty was an illusion, a weapon he used with surgical precision. He understood what neither of them did, that the future belonged not to the most feared man, but to the most adaptable one. The Castellamarese War tore through New York between 1929 and 1931. Streets ran red with the blood of soldiers and lieutenants. Restaurants, warehouses, and social clubs became killing grounds. But amid the chaos, Luciano remained calm, detached, and calculating. He wasn't fighting for turf, he was fighting for evolution. In April 1931, Luciano made his move. He arranged a peace meeting with Joe Masuria at Coney Island's Nuova Villa Tomorrow restaurant. The two men played cards, laughed, shared wine, and then at Luciano's signal, his men entered. In seconds, gunfire shattered the silence. Masuria slumped forward, riddled with bullets. Luciano, as planned, had stepped out moments earlier, leaving his old boss to his fate. The old world began to crumble right there, between the clatter of poker chips and the scent of blood and garlic. Masuria's death cleared the way for Maranzano, who wasted no time declaring himself capo di tutti capi. For a brief moment, Luciano pretended loyalty. Maranzano's organization was sophisticated, structured, hierarchical, inspired by Julius Caesar's Rome. He introduced ranks, titles, and the idea of a family, led by a boss, an underboss, and capo regimes. To Luciano it was an improvement, but still limited. Maranzano's vision was rooted in control through fear. Luciano wanted control through cooperation. Luciano quickly realized that Maranzano was no ally. He was another dictator in a new robe. Worse, Maranzano had begun to suspect Luciano's ambitions. Rumors spread that Luciano and his partners, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello, were planning to modernize the Mafia by partnering with Jewish and Irish gangs. To Maranzano this was blasphemy. He saw Luciano as a threat, one that needed to be eliminated. Luciano acted first. In September 1931, he sent a team of killers disguised as tax agents to Maranzano's office in Manhattan. They disarmed his guards, stormed in, and ended the reign of the last boss of bosses, with a hail of bullets. When the smoke cleared, Salvatore Maranzano was dead, and the old Mafia, bound by Sicilian arrogance and superstition, died with him. The aftermath was seismic. Luciano immediately abolished the title of Capo di Tutti Capi, declaring that no single man should rule over all. In its place, he created the Commission, a council of bosses representing the major mafia families across America. It was an act of genius disguised as diplomacy. The Commission would serve as the mafia's governing body, mediating disputes, managing territories, and ensuring peace among the families. For the first time, organized crime was truly organized. This transformation marked the moment Luciano became more than a gangster. He was now a statesman of the underworld, a man who saw beyond vendettas and bloodlines. His new system mirrored corporate America, regional autonomy under a central authority. He established 5 powerful families in New York, the Lucchese, Bonanno, Gambino, Genovese, and Colombo families, each with its own territory and hierarchy, but all answerable to the Commission. This was Luciano's revolution, not built on bullets but on structure. He had replaced feudal chaos with bureaucratic order, turning street violence into management, and transforming a scattered criminal underworld into a networked empire that spanned the nation. The emotional weight of this transformation was immense. Luciano had killed his mentors, betrayed his heritage, and rewritten the rules of the game. Yet he felt no regret, only clarity. In his mind, he wasn't destroying tradition, he was saving it. The old ways could no longer survive in America's fast-moving world. If the Mafia didn't modernize, it would vanish. Psychologically, this marked the solidification of Luciano's philosophy: efficiency over emotion, profit over pride. He didn't believe in loyalty for loyalty's sake. He believed in results. The men who followed him weren't bound by blood, but by shared interest. That made them more dangerous, more dependable, and more willing to kill. The death of the Mustache Petes was not just the end of an era. It was the beginning of a system that would define organized crime for the next century. Luciano's empire would operate like a machine, one that could adapt, expand, and endure. He had stripped the Mafia of its old superstitions and replaced them with strategy. As the dust settled on the Castellamarese War, New York entered a new age. The old bosses were buried, the streets grew quiet, and a single name began to circulate in whispers through every gambling den, speakeasy, and backroom bar. Lucky Luciano, the man who had killed tradition to build an empire. He had done the impossible, brought order to the underworld. But every revolution carries its price, and every deal has its debt. The question was not whether Luciano could control the empire he had built, but how long it would take before it started to control him. The assassination of Salvatore Maranzano was more than the end of a war, it was the birth of an empire. In the silence that followed the final gunshots of 1931, Charles "Lucky" Luciano emerged as something the criminal world had never seen before. A man who could turn bloodshed into bureaucracy, chaos into structure. What he created next would become one of the most sophisticated power systems in American history, a government of criminals known simply as the Commission. The idea came to Luciano during the final months of the Castellamarese War, when he realized that constant violence was bad for business. Every time a boss was killed, revenue stopped. Every funeral meant lost profits. To Luciano, power wasn't about ruling through fear, it was about continuity. He didn't want to be another dictator who ruled until someone put a bullet in his head. He wanted a system that would outlive him, one that could run itself. Luciano's vision was simple yet revolutionary: a national board of directors for organized crime. Each major family would have a seat at the table. No single boss would claim ultimate authority. Instead, disputes would be settled collectively, profits divided rationally, and decisions made through consensus. It was the Mafia's first step from feudal violence to organized governance, a criminal democracy born from necessity. To understand how radical this was, you have to understand the Mafia's DNA. For generations, power had flowed downward, from the top boss to his soldiers, enforced by loyalty, blood oaths, and terror. Luciano flipped that model on its head. He wanted horizontal power, a structure that balanced influence among families, created checks and balances, and allowed for expansion without anarchy. It was a corporate merger of crime, with himself as the quiet chairman of the board. The first official meeting of the commission took place in 1931 at the Park Central Hotel in Manhattan. The room was filled with men who had survived the wars and understood the cost of disunity. Among them, Luciano representing the newly formed Genovese family, Joe Bonanno, a young but ambitious Sicilian from Brooklyn, Tommy Lucchese, the quiet tactician, Vincent Mangano representing the docks, and Joseph Prophesy, whose network controlled much of the city's distribution rackets. Beyond New York, powerful regional bosses were also invited. Al Capone's Chicago outfit, the Cleveland and Buffalo families, and representatives from Philadelphia and Detroit. Together, these men formed the Mafia's new ruling council. Each boss retained autonomy over his own territory, but all agreed to follow shared rules. No killings of other bosses without approval, no interference in another family's business, and no operations that drew excessive police attention. Every major decision would go through the commission, including punishment, mediation, and territorial disputes. For Luciano, this was genius in motion. It turned rivals into shareholders. By giving everyone a piece of the pie, he eliminated the need for endless turf wars. Profit replaced pride. Negotiation replaced vendetta. Violence didn't disappear, but it became regulated, controlled, strategic, almost administrative. The Mafia, once defined by emotional outbursts, had become a system of logic. But Luciano's brilliance wasn't just in the structure, it was in how he built loyalty. He understood people better than any gangster before him. He knew that fear created compliance, but opportunity created devotion. The commission gave every boss a reason to protect the system because the system protected their wealth. It was the purest form of power, self-sustaining and self-interested. He also knew how to use perception as a weapon. Luciano rarely gave direct orders. Instead, he operated through influence, persuasion, and presence. When he spoke, others listened. His leadership wasn't built on screaming or intimidation, but on the quiet confidence of a man who had already survived more than most. He was the king who didn't need a crown, because everyone already knew who ruled. The structure of the commission mirrored legitimate corporations. Each Mafia family operated as an independent business unit, complete with hierarchy. At the top sat the boss, followed by the underboss, capo regimes, and soldiers. Beneath them were associates, freelancers, fixers, and politicians who did the dirty work without ever being made. Luciano's genius was in formalizing this system across the nation, ensuring consistency from coast to coast. Everyone knew their role. Everyone knew the price of betrayal. Beyond internal organization, Luciano introduced the concept of diversification. The Mafia would no longer rely on a single illegal trade. Prohibition wouldn't last forever, and when it ended, the gangs that lived only off bootlegging would die. So he expanded into new industries: gambling, narcotics, prostitution, labor unions, and construction. Each venture was managed like a corporate division, often fronted by legitimate businesses. He turned the Mafia into a shadow economy, one that touched every layer of American life. Politically, Luciano was no fool. He understood that survival depended on cooperation with power. Through his right-hand man Frank Costello, he cultivated connections in City Hall, the police department, and even state government. Money flowed both ways: protection for politicians, freedom for the Mafia. It was an unspoken partnership that would shape New York's political machine for decades. But the commission wasn't just about money. Psychologically, it represented Luciano's attempt to impose order on a world that had none. He had seen what chaos did, how tradition turned into tyranny, how loyalty turned into bloodshed. The commission was his way of creating predictability, a structure where even criminals could follow rules. In his mind, he wasn't just a gangster, he was a reformer. A visionary who believed that stability was the highest form of power. Still, there was a darker undercurrent beneath this brilliance. The system Luciano built required constant balance. If one family grew too powerful, the others would unite against it. If one boss broke the rules, the fragile peace could crumble overnight. And because there was no true enforcement mechanism beyond murder, every decision carried the risk of war. It was peace maintained by fear, elegant on the surface, volatile beneath. The public had no idea how deep the Mafia's influence had already grown. From the docks to the unions, from the speakeasies to the police stations, Luciano's fingerprints were everywhere, yet invisible. The newspapers wrote about him as a mysterious figure, a man who moved behind the curtain while others took the spotlight. That was exactly how he wanted it. By 1932, the Mafia was more organized than ever before, wealthier, more disciplined, and almost untouchable. Luciano had achieved what no one before him had even dared to imagine. He had built a self-governing underworld that mirrored the structure of America's own capitalism. But as the commission expanded, so did its ambition. Money began flowing in from Chicago, Cleveland, New Orleans, and Havana. Crime became a national industry, and Lucky Luciano was its silent CEO. Yet even he knew that power never remained stable for long. The more refined the system became, the more fragile it was. In his private moments, Luciano often reflected on what he had created. He had united men through greed but not through trust. His empire was efficient, but soulless. And though the commission had ended the blood wars, it hadn't changed human nature. The same ambition that made it possible would one day threaten to tear it apart. For now, however, Luciano stood at the pinnacle of power, a man who had turned crime into governance, who had rewritten the rules of the American underworld. But every structure, no matter how strong, carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. And soon, the machine Luciano built would begin to feed on itself. Lucky Luciano's genius wasn't just in building a criminal government, it was in learning how to make it profitable, sustainable, and invisible. After the smoke cleared from the Prohibition era, the underworld was left with a question that would define its future. What happens when the alcohol dries up? For most gangsters, the end of Prohibition in 1933 meant the end of easy money. For Luciano, it meant a new beginning. He understood something others didn't, that crime, like any other business, required diversification. He would turn the Mafia into a corporate empire, operating across multiple industries, hidden in plain sight. Luciano's empire wasn't just about illegal rackets, it was about systems of cash flow. Gambling, prostitution, narcotics, labor racketeering, loan sharking, and protection. Each was a revenue stream, each managed like a division within a Fortune 500 company. To him, every vice was a market. And every market could be organized. It started with gambling. In the early 1930s, gambling was the beating heart of organized crime, and Luciano knew it could be legitimized in the public's eyes. He took inspiration from Meyer Lansky, his longtime friend and financial strategist, who saw gambling not as a petty hustle but as a business of dreams. Together they began setting up controlled gambling dens, racetracks, and casinos, first in New York and New Jersey, then spreading toward Florida and Havana. They partnered with established gamblers, ensuring that the house always won, and that the profits always flowed upward through Luciano's network. Meyer Lansky's influence was crucial. He was the brain behind the numbers, cautious, methodical, and obsessed with efficiency. Where Luciano saw power, Lansky saw structure. The two complemented each other like CEO and CFO. They created ledgers, laundering systems, and offshore accounts long before such things became common in criminal enterprise. Their goal wasn't just to make money, it was to make clean money. Luciano also revolutionized prostitution rackets in New York, turning what had once been scattered street-level operations into a vast, coordinated system. He eliminated the chaotic, violent pimps who drew police attention and replaced them with managers, bookkeepers, and enforcers who treated sex work like a regulated trade. His control over Manhattan's brothels was so extensive that the press would later call it the Combination, a name that perfectly captured Luciano's corporate vision. It wasn't morality that guided him, but efficiency. If a service was in demand, he wanted to supply it, but in an orderly, profitable way. He applied the same logic to narcotics, although this business came with far greater risk. Officially, Luciano denied any involvement in drug trafficking. Unofficially, the Mafia's heroin routes began taking shape under his watch. Through contacts in Marseille, Sicily, and Havana, Luciano's network began importing small but lucrative shipments of narcotics into the United States. He understood that drugs were dangerous, not just because of the law but because they attracted chaos. Still, the profits were impossible to ignore. He ensured that drug operations were tightly compartmentalized. If one part fell, the rest would remain untouched. It was a lesson in damage control, decades ahead of its time. Yet Luciano's most ambitious and least understood venture was labor racketeering. He realized that the Mafia could gain not just money but power by controlling the unions that controlled America's workforce. Dockworkers, truckers, construction crews, all could be leveraged. With his ally Frank Costello acting as the political bridge, Luciano infiltrated the International Longshoremen's Association and the Teamsters. By manipulating labor strikes and offering protection, he forced legitimate businesses to play by Mafia rules. It was extortion disguised as negotiation, corruption disguised as cooperation. This system gave Luciano an invisible hand in America's economy. When workers went on strike, he decided how long it lasted. When goods needed to move through the docks, he decided how fast they flowed. By owning the unions, he didn't just make money, he made himself indispensable. The government couldn't function, the city couldn't move, and business couldn't operate without his silent approval. Psychologically, this shift was profound. Luciano no longer saw himself as a gangster hiding from the law. He saw himself as a businessman operating around the law. He once told an associate, "There's no difference between a politician, a banker, and a gangster, they just wear different suits." In his mind he was part of the same ecosystem, playing by the same rules, only more honestly. He didn't pretend to be moral. He was pragmatic. Luciano also understood the value of image. He dressed impeccably, spoke with refinement, and conducted meetings like an executive. His table manners, his speech patterns, even his posture were calculated to project authority and sophistication. Gone was the crude, loud gangster stereotype. Luciano was the modern face of crime, calm, strategic, and always 3 steps ahead. This psychological manipulation extended to his men as well. He rewarded loyalty, promoted competence, and punished recklessness. Those who could think thrived under him. Those who couldn't were quietly removed. Behind closed doors, Luciano's operations thrived on corruption. Money flowed into the pockets of police captains, judges, and politicians. His connection to Tammany Hall ensured protection at the city level. Frank Costello's influence in Albany and beyond opened doors in the state legislature. Luciano's empire didn't just exist because of criminal power, it existed because of political tolerance. The Mafia became part of the city's bloodstream, so deeply woven into its economy that cutting it out would have meant killing the patient. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's network was pulling in millions every month. Every dollar that passed through gambling tables, brothels, or union offices carried a trace of his influence. Yet the more success he achieved, the more invisible he became. Luciano understood that true power was quiet, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. Still, beneath the surface, danger was building. The same order that had made the Mafia strong also made it vulnerable. Every structured system can be traced, every hierarchy can be infiltrated. And while Luciano believed his empire was too sophisticated to fall, the law was finally learning how to follow the money. The seeds of his eventual downfall were already being planted, not by rival gangsters, but by an ambitious prosecutor named Thomas E. Dewey, who saw Luciano not as a myth, but as a man who could be caught. But for now, Luciano's empire represented the perfect synthesis of crime and capitalism. He had turned the underworld into an economy, one that ran parallel to legitimate America, sharing its ambitions, its greed, and its illusions of control. In boardrooms and back alleys alike, Lucky Luciano ruled. Not as a king surrounded by soldiers, but as a businessman commanding markets of vice. His shadow stretched from Havana to Harlem, from the union halls to the mayor's office. And in his mind, it was only the beginning. Power, by its nature, breeds enemies, and in Lucky Luciano's world, even allies could become threats overnight. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's empire had reached a scale no gangster before him could have imagined. He had created stability in an underworld defined by chaos. But stability comes with a cost: resentment, ambition, paranoia. The higher Luciano climbed, the more he became a symbol, and symbols attract challengers. This was the era when the American Mafia's balance of power was as delicate as glass. Every handshake held hidden tension, every alliance hid buried betrayal. Luciano may have replaced the bloody street wars with business suits and boardrooms, but human nature, greed, jealousy, pride, was still the invisible enemy. At the center of his network were his most trusted allies: Frank Costello, the prime minister of the underworld; Meyer Lansky, the accountant with a brain like a machine; and Tommy Lucchese, the quiet, surgical tactician. Each man complemented the other. Costello handled politics and diplomacy, Lansky managed finances and foreign ventures, and Lucchese maintained discipline within New York. Together they formed Luciano's inner circle, the men who turned his vision into reality. But beyond this circle were others whose loyalty was more fragile. Vito Genovese, Luciano's ambitious underboss, was one of them. Genovese admired Luciano, but envy simmered beneath his obedience. He wanted to be more than an underboss. He wanted to be the boss. To him, Luciano's reliance on outsiders like Lansky, a Jewish associate, was a sign of weakness, even betrayal of the old Sicilian code. Genovese represented the old world, traditional, suspicious, and brutally self-serving. The tension between them was subtle at first. Luciano valued Genovese's ruthlessness. He was efficient, fearless, and loyal when it suited him. But he also knew that Genovese's loyalty was conditional, tied to opportunity. Luciano once told Lansky half-jokingly, "Vito's the kind of guy who'd hold the door for you, and then shoot you when you walk through." It was said with a smile, but everyone knew there was truth behind the humor. Meanwhile, outside forces were shifting. The government, emboldened by public outcry against organized crime, was starting to close in. Federal prosecutors like Thomas E. Dewey had begun tracing the webs of corruption that Luciano and his men had so carefully hidden. Raids on brothels and gambling parlors became more frequent. Newspapers began printing stories about the Syndicate, the shadowy national organization that seemed to control crime from coast to coast. The public was terrified but fascinated. Inside the underworld, paranoia grew. The very structure that had made the commission stable also made it vulnerable. Every boss had his own ambitions, his own definition of respect. Joe Bonanno, for example, quietly expanded his operations into new territories, sometimes without commission approval. Others, like Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, operated as enforcers for hire, loyal to whoever paid best. The Mafia was supposed to be a family of equals, but equality rarely survives in a kingdom of power. Luciano's ability to keep the peace depended on his reputation for fairness. When disputes arose, over territory, money, or murder, he was the final arbiter. His word was law. Yet even he couldn't control the growing undercurrents of discontent. The criminal world thrived on ambition, and ambition has no patience for peace. One of the most volatile sources of tension came from the relationship between the Italian and Jewish factions. While Luciano and Lansky had proven that cross-ethnic cooperation could build an empire, not everyone agreed. Old guard mafiosi like Joe Prophesai and Vincent Mangano viewed the inclusion of Jewish partners as a betrayal of Sicilian purity. They whispered that Luciano had diluted the Mafia's honor, that he was turning tradition into business and honor into greed. Luciano, ever pragmatic, dismissed them. "Honor doesn't pay the bills," he would say. But the whispers planted seeds of doubt. These ideological divides ran deeper than anyone realized. On one side were the modernizers, Luciano, Lansky, Costello, who saw crime as an enterprise to be managed. On the other were the traditionalists, men like Genovese, Prophesai, and Mangano, who still believed in blood oaths, family hierarchy, and ethnic purity. The commission had been designed to unite them, but increasingly, it began to resemble a congress of rivals waiting for an opportunity to strike. Luciano also faced growing competition from beyond New York. Chicago's outfit, under Frank Nitti after Capone's fall, began expanding eastward. The Midwestern families wanted greater control over national gambling routes and union rackets. In Cleveland, Detroit, and Philadelphia, smaller bosses began acting independently, cutting side deals that bypassed commission oversight. The empire Luciano had built was spreading faster than he could control it. And the faster it spread, the thinner his influence became. Psychologically, this was the beginning of a new kind of war, not one fought with guns but with manipulation and fear. Luciano, once the ultimate unifier, began to feel the weight of leadership pressing down on him. Every decision could spark a rebellion. Every compromise could be seen as weakness. His brilliance had built the system, but his humanity was becoming its liability. Frank Costello, ever the voice of reason, urged caution. "We can't be everywhere, Charlie," he told Luciano during one late-night meeting in 1935. "We built something too big to watch all the time. Let the bosses handle their turf. We just keep the peace." Luciano nodded, but his instincts told him otherwise. He knew that once you stop watching, the wolves move in. And indeed, one of those wolves was already moving. Vito Genovese began making quiet alliances of his own, whispering in the ears of other bosses, suggesting that Luciano's leadership had made them too visible, too vulnerable. He argued that the commission had brought unwanted attention from the press and law enforcement, that the Mafia had lost its secrecy. Behind closed doors, Genovese painted himself as the man who could restore the old ways, protect the organization's soul. At the same time, law enforcement's noose was tightening. Thomas E. Dewey, the ambitious prosecutor from Manhattan, began connecting the dots between Luciano's prostitution rackets and political corruption. He didn't yet have enough evidence to strike, but he had the will. And he knew that bringing down Lucky Luciano would make his career. The walls were beginning to close in, and Luciano's empire, so meticulously organized, was now riddled with invisible cracks. His enemies weren't just in the government or the streets, they were in his own boardroom. He had replaced bullets with business plans, but power still drew blood. Psychologically, Luciano began to retreat inward. He trusted fewer people, relied more on Lansky and Costello, and spent increasing time away from public life. His paranoia wasn't unfounded. Every major boss had his own secrets. Every associate had a price. The very system he built to prevent betrayal was now breeding it. Still, Luciano maintained his composure. In public he was calm, charming, and confident, the picture of control. But privately he could feel the foundation shifting beneath him. The alliances that had once made him untouchable were now liabilities. The underworld was evolving again, and this time the evolution wasn't in his favor. The Mafia had become too powerful, too visible, too ambitious. And in a world where ambition is the deadliest weapon, even lucky Luciano couldn't outrun the inevitable. The storm was coming, from within and without. Rivals plotting in the shadows, prosecutors building cases in the light. The balance he had fought so hard to create was beginning to fracture. And soon, that fracture would explode into his greatest test yet, a test that would determine not just the fate of his empire but the future of organized crime in America. By 1935, Lucky Luciano's world was beginning to tremble, not with the noise of war, but with the quiet hum of investigation. The bloodshed of the old Mafia days had been replaced by whispers in government offices, surveillance, and sealed indictments. This was a different kind of battlefield now, one where courtroom documents replaced machine guns, and where enemies didn't wear fedoras but tailored suits. It was the hidden war, fought in shadows, headlines, and behind closed doors. Luciano didn't realize it yet, but his greatest threat wasn't another gangster. It was an ambitious prosecutor named Thomas E. Dewey, a man who saw himself not as a politician but as a crusader. Dewey's mission was simple: to destroy organized crime at its roots. And for him, Lucky Luciano was the perfect symbol of everything that was wrong with America's underworld. A man who lived in luxury, who flaunted his power, who had corrupted the system from within. Dewey was precise, methodical, and incorruptible. He refused bribes, ignored threats, and thrived on publicity. To the public he was a hero, the man finally taking on the Mafia. But to Luciano he was a menace. For the first time, Luciano was facing an enemy who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or outmaneuvered. The trouble began with prostitution. For years, Luciano had quietly overseen an empire of brothels throughout New York. Hundreds of them, operated through layers of intermediaries. It wasn't something he bragged about. To him, prostitution was a business like any other, controlled, organized, and profitable. He never met the women, never visited the parlors. Everything was done through managers, bookkeepers, and collectors. It was efficient and anonymous. But anonymity doesn't last forever. In 1935, Dewey's office began targeting mid-level operators, pimps, madams, and bookkeepers, who ran Luciano's brothel network. He ordered undercover raids, tapped phones, and pressured arrested prostitutes to talk. Most said nothing. But Dewey didn't need everyone to talk, he just needed one person to break. That person was Cokie Flo Brown, a heroin-addicted madam who ran several brothels under Luciano's system. Facing prison and withdrawal, she began to talk, and what she said would change history. She described a network of hundreds of women, dozens of managers, and one invisible figure at the top, Charlie Lucky. It wasn't direct evidence, but it was enough to build a narrative, and in a courtroom, narrative is power. Dewey used Flo's testimony to trace money flows, connect names, and identify the men behind the operation. Soon, his team began rounding up Luciano's associates, flipping them one by one. At first, Luciano didn't take it seriously. He had survived wars, assassinations, betrayals. What was one prosecutor compared to that? But Dewey was relentless. He wanted not just arrests but spectacle. Every raid was followed by a press conference. Every headline screamed the same message: Lucky Luciano, King of Vice. Luciano's name, once whispered in the dark, was now plastered across front pages. The irony was painful. The man who had built an invisible empire was now the face of organized crime in America. The pressure mounted quickly. Police raided hotels, apartments, and nightclubs. Luciano's lieutenants were hauled in for questioning. Even his political allies began to distance themselves. Frank Costello urged him to lay low, maybe even leave the country for a while. But Luciano refused. "I built this city," he told Costello. "I'm not running from some pencil pusher with a law degree." That bravado would soon become his undoing. In early 1936, Dewey issued a warrant for Luciano's arrest. But when police stormed his known locations, Luciano was gone. He had fled to Hot Springs, Arkansas, a famous retreat known for its mineral baths, gambling, and corruption, a place where politicians and gangsters mingled without judgment. There, Luciano hoped to ride out the storm, relying on bribes to keep the law at bay. For a while it worked. The local sheriff treated him like a guest, not a fugitive. Luciano played cards, entertained visitors, and laughed at the idea that Dewey could ever touch him. But Dewey's influence had grown far beyond New York. When he discovered Luciano's whereabouts, he coordinated with Arkansas authorities and federal marshals to bring him back. On April 1, 1936, in a twist of bitter irony, Lucky Luciano, the man who had outsmarted the Mafia and the police for a decade, was arrested while relaxing at a spa. He didn't resist. He knew the real battle would be in court. The extradition was humiliating. Reporters photographed him in handcuffs, surrounded by detectives as he was escorted back to New York. The headlines were merciless: "Lucky's luck runs out." To Dewey it was a victory before the trial even began. To Luciano it was the beginning of the end. But even in defeat, Luciano remained composed. "They can't prove a thing," he told reporters. "I'm just a businessman." And technically he wasn't lying. Dewey had no physical evidence connecting him directly to prostitution. What he had was testimony, hearsay, and the public's hunger for a villain. Behind the scenes, the commission was uneasy. If Luciano fell, the entire structure could be exposed. Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky tried to distance the larger syndicate from the prostitution case, framing it as Luciano's personal business. Vito Genovese, ever the opportunist, saw his chance. With Luciano distracted, Genovese began consolidating power, reaching out to allies, strengthening his network, and positioning himself as the natural successor. The hidden war had now split into two fronts. On one side, Luciano was battling the government in public courtrooms. On the other, he was fighting invisible betrayal from within. Meanwhile, the media circus intensified. Dewey made sure of it. His press releases painted Luciano as a modern Caesar of crime, a man who ruled through corruption and fear. Every day, newspapers printed news stories, real or exaggerated, about Luciano's control over City Hall, police captains, and judges. The myth grew larger than the man. Luciano watched in silence as his empire was dismantled piece by piece. Brothels closed, gambling dens went dark, and union bosses began denying they ever knew him. His world, the world he had built so carefully, was vanishing in slow motion. Psychologically, it was the first time Luciano felt powerless. He had always believed in control, of men, money, and fate. But now, control was slipping through his fingers. The more he denied involvement, the more guilty he appeared. Every headline, every courtroom rumor, was another nail in the coffin of his invincibility. Still he refused to show fear. "They can lock me up," he told Lansky quietly, "but they can't kill what I built." He meant it. The commission still existed, and even behind bars he believed he could continue to rule. But the hidden war was no longer hidden. It was about to explode in public view, and for the first time in his life, Lucky Luciano wouldn't be the one controlling the battlefield. The prosecutor had his case. The nation had its villain. And the trial that followed would become one of the most sensational legal dramas in American history. A war of words, power, and reputation that would decide not only Luciano's fate, but the future of organized crime itself. The year was 1936, and the name Lucky Luciano had become both a legend and a target. For over a decade, he had reigned as the quiet emperor of the American underworld, invisible, untouchable, and always 2 steps ahead. But when Thomas E. Dewey's investigation finally reached its climax, the empire Luciano had built on discretion and control began to unravel. What followed was not just a legal defeat, but a psychological unmasking, the slow disintegration of a man who had once believed himself invincible. Luciano's arrest in Hot Springs had sent shockwaves through the criminal world. For the first time, the architect of modern organized crime was being paraded before cameras like a common criminal. Newspapers printed his photograph daily: slick hair, confident smirk, tailored suit, under headlines that declared him the Vice King of New York. For the public it was thrilling. For the Mafia it was terrifying. Back in New York, Dewey's prosecution team moved fast. They charged Luciano with compulsory prostitution, a legal term broad enough to cover his alleged control of the city's brothel network. Dewey's case was built not on hard evidence, but on testimony, a fragile chain of witnesses, most of them women who had once worked within the system. Their stories were inconsistent, their memories fogged by fear and addiction. But Dewey had something more powerful than facts: a narrative. He painted Luciano as the shadowy ruler of a criminal machine that exploited women, corrupted officials, and treated human lives as profit margins. It was a story perfectly crafted for the newspapers, a moral crusade in an age of scandal. Dewey didn't just want a conviction. He wanted to destroy the myth of the untouchable gangster once and for all. Luciano's defense team, led by the sharp and seasoned attorney George Morton Levy, argued that the charges were absurd. Luciano had never met these women, never entered a brothel, never taken money from prostitution. The accusations, they said, were based entirely on coerced testimony from unreliable witnesses seeking leniency. Levy framed the prosecution as a witch hunt, designed to boost Dewey's political career. Behind the scenes, Luciano remained calm, at least outwardly. He wore his best suits to court, smiled for reporters and lit cigarettes with steady hands. But those close to him noticed the cracks. He slept little, paced constantly, and began drinking more than usual. The man who had once controlled an empire of fear was now living under its shadow. As the trial unfolded, Dewey's witnesses took the stand one by one. Among them was Cokie Flo Brown, the heroin-addicted madam whose cooperation had triggered the investigation. Her testimony was erratic but sensational. She claimed that Luciano's men collected profits from every brothel, that they operated with military precision, and that all major decisions went upstairs to Charlie Lucky. Luciano watched her speak without flinching. His expression was unreadable, part disbelief, part resignation. He knew Dewey was using the oldest weapon in the system: fear. Most of the witnesses had been threatened with long prison terms unless they cooperated. But even if they were lying, the damage was already done. Public opinion turned against him quickly. To many Americans, Luciano was no longer the clever businessman of the underworld. He was a moral villain, the face of corruption, the man who had turned sin into an industry. The irony was bitter. The same newspapers that once admired his sophistication now printed caricatures of him as a soulless tyrant. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Reporters filled every seat. The jurors were under immense pressure to deliver a statement, not just a verdict. And Thomas Dewey, ever the showman, played his part perfectly. He delivered speeches about morality, about America's decay, about the need to restore justice. His voice echoed with righteous conviction. Luciano's lawyers countered by attacking Dewey's methods. They exposed inconsistencies in the witnesses' stories, highlighted the lack of direct evidence, and accused the prosecution of manipulating the media. But no argument could undo the spectacle. The trial had become theater, and in theater, emotion always beats reason. As the days turned into weeks, Luciano's allies grew nervous. Frank Costello visited him daily, urging him to consider an out-of-court settlement or plea deal. Meyer Lansky offered to use his contacts to influence jurors quietly. But Luciano refused. "I don't beg," he said flatly. "If they want to hang me, they'll do it without me crawling." The trial reached its breaking point in late June. Dewey delivered his closing argument like a sermon, calling Luciano a man who turned vice into a science and a dictator of degradation. The words hit hard. The jurors, already overwhelmed by weeks of scandalous testimony, didn't take long to deliberate. On June 18, 1936, the verdict came down: guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. The sentence was staggering: 30 to 50 years in prison. The courtroom erupted. Reporters ran to telephones, shouting the news to editors. Dewey smiled faintly, knowing his name would now be immortalized as the man who broke Lucky Luciano. Luciano, meanwhile, sat still, his expression calm but his jaw clenched tight. A lifetime of power, wealth, and invincibility, erased in a single moment. As marshals led him away, he turned to one of his lawyers and said quietly, "Don't worry. They got me in here, but I still got them out there." It was both defiance and prophecy. Psychologically, the conviction marked the beginning of a transformation. Luciano had always believed that his intelligence made him untouchable, that he could outthink the system. But now he was facing a truth he'd spent years avoiding: the world had changed. Crime was no longer about bullets and backrooms. It was about perception, politics, and public opinion. For the Mafia, the fallout was immediate. The commission was thrown into chaos. Vito Genovese saw his opportunity and began maneuvering to take control of Luciano's interests. Frank Costello stepped up to maintain stability, acting as a caretaker of sorts. But with their leader behind bars, the delicate peace Luciano had enforced began to fray. Old rivalries resurfaced. New alliances formed. In prison, Luciano maintained his composure, but inside he felt the sting of betrayal. He knew that some of his own men had cooperated with Dewey, feeding him information. He knew that others were already fighting over his empire. He wasn't afraid of prison. He was afraid of irrelevance. For a man who had built his life around control, confinement was a kind of death. But even then, Luciano's mind never stopped working. He read newspapers, followed every political move, and listened closely to the whispers that reached him from the outside. He knew the game wasn't over. Not yet. He still had influence. He still had loyalty. And he still believed in one unshakable truth: power could survive walls, if he knew how to use it. In the months that followed, he began rebuilding even from his cell. Messages passed through lawyers, visitors, and bribed guards. Slowly, quietly, Lucky Luciano began turning his prison sentence into a new kind of command center. The fall had begun, but in his mind the empire still lived. The courtroom that had once been a stage for spectacle now became a theater of reckoning. The trial of Lucky Luciano was over, but its echoes continued to ripple through New York City, through the newspapers, the streets, and the corridors of power. What unfolded next was not merely the punishment of a criminal, but the dismantling of a myth. The man who had once been untouchable was now reduced to a number in a prison ledger. But even then the story wasn't so simple, because Luciano's conviction didn't just serve justice. It served interest. When the verdict was read aloud, the reaction was seismic. Headlines screamed victory for law and order. Thomas E. Dewey became a national hero overnight, the young, fearless prosecutor who had slain the dragon of organized crime. His career would skyrocket from that courtroom. Within years he'd become the governor of New York and even a presidential candidate. But Dewey's victory was more than political, it was symbolic. He had broken the illusion that men like Luciano were beyond reach. The newspapers, which once glamorized gangsters as American folk heroes, now joined in the moral crusade. Editorials painted Luciano as the embodiment of corruption, the dark mirror of the American dream. In the public eye, he was no longer a clever businessman or a product of circumstance. He was evil, pure, sophisticated evil, the kind that wears a suit instead of a gun holster. But the truth behind those headlines was more complicated. Luciano's conviction, while celebrated, rested on fragile ground. Many of Dewey's witnesses were later found to have been coerced or compensated, their testimonies inconsistent or outright false. There were whispers of deals made behind closed doors, of evidence conveniently lost or found. But by then the verdict was unassailable, because it wasn't just about evidence. It was about narrative. Luciano, sitting in his cell at Sing Sing before his transfer upstate, understood this better than anyone. He had built his empire on the manipulation of stories, on perception, fear, and control. Now, that same strategy had been turned against him. "They didn't convict me for what I did," he reportedly said. "They convicted me for who I am." And in a sense he was right. Dewey hadn't just prosecuted a man, he'd prosecuted a symbol. Luciano had come to represent everything the country wanted to bury about itself: greed, ambition, moral compromise. Punishing him wasn't just about crime, it was about redemption. When he was finally transferred to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, a bleak, fortress-like prison near the Canadian border, the message was clear. He wasn't just being imprisoned, he was being erased. The state wanted to make an example of him, to show that no man, no matter how clever or connected, could outmaneuver the law. But behind those cold stone walls, Luciano's story took on a new dimension. For the first time since his youth he was truly powerless. No nightclubs, no telephones, no lieutenants waiting for his orders. Just silence, monotony, and reflection. Yet in that silence something began to shift. The world outside was changing fast. It was the late 1930s, Prohibition was over, the economy was recovering, and whispers of war were spreading across Europe. The old underworld economy was evolving, adapting to new realities. Luciano, from his cell, could only watch as others began taking his place. Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, Vito Genovese, each maneuvering for dominance. The machine he had built still ran, but now it answered to other hands. Psychologically, the trial and sentence forced Luciano to confront the very principles that had defined his life. Loyalty, once his cornerstone, had fractured under pressure. Dozens of his men had testified, talked, or quietly switched sides. Others fled. The code of omerta, the sacred silence, had been broken, and Luciano realized that even his carefully constructed empire was not immune to fear. From his prison bunk, he studied his own downfall like a strategist reviewing a lost battle. He understood where he'd overreached, how his hunger for legitimacy had made him visible. The brothel racket and truth had been beneath him, petty, risky, and too public. But Luciano had allowed it to exist, allowed his name to hover around it, because he believed he was untouchable. It wasn't greed that destroyed him, it was pride. In interviews years later he would say, "I wasn't guilty of what they said I'd done, but I was guilty of being stupid. You don't get careless in this life. Not even once." That was Luciano's confession, not of crime but of hubris. The trial had also exposed the thin line between law and power. Dewey, for all his moral rhetoric, had played the game much like Luciano did: leverage, alliances, perception. Both men understood the same truth, that control was psychological. The difference was that Dewey wore a badge and Luciano wore a scar. The courtroom had been their battlefield, and in many ways both had won. Dewey gained glory. Luciano gained immortality. But as Luciano's appeals were denied one after another, his myth began to ossify into legend. Newspapers wrote about his grace under defeat, his refusal to cooperate with authorities, his composure even as he faced decades behind bars. He became an archetype, the stoic fallen king. Yet behind the myth was a man unraveling. He missed the city, the rhythm, the lights, the sound of deals being made. In the long nights he would replay his life like a film reel. The first time he met Lansky, the first bribe he paid to a cop, the first time he ordered a killing. Each decision had been made for control, and each had brought him closer to this cell. Still, Luciano never accepted the word defeat. Even as guards watched him closely, he began to find cracks in the system. A sympathetic warden here, a bribed messenger there. Slowly, carefully, he began sending notes, short messages disguised in legal letters or family correspondence. To the untrained eye they were meaningless. To men like Costello and Lansky they were orders. He couldn't see it yet, but the next chapter of his story would be born from this confinement. His empire would survive, even evolve, because the mind of Lucky Luciano was never still. Meanwhile, outside those walls, Dewey basked in his triumph. He gave speeches about morality, about cleaning the streets of vice, about America's renewed conscience. But behind closed doors, law enforcement knew the truth. They had cut off the head, but the body still lived. For every brothel shut down, 2 new rackets emerged. For every gangster imprisoned, 3 others took his place. Dewey's victory was real but temporary, because the system Luciano created was too efficient, too decentralized, too embedded in the very fabric of the city. And somewhere in that irony Luciano found comfort. From his narrow cell window, he would look at the mountains beyond the prison walls and smile faintly. They thought they'd buried him, but he knew better. Empires like his didn't die in courtrooms, they adapted. The trial had taken his freedom but not his power. The sentence had taken his name but not his legend. And as he began to weave his influence from the shadows of confinement, Lucky Luciano prepared for the one thing no one saw coming. A resurrection that would rewrite his legacy and test the very boundaries between crime and patriotism. Prison walls are supposed to end empires, but for Lucky Luciano they became his new headquarters. When he arrived at Clinton Correctional Facility, the guards expected arrogance, defiance, perhaps even desperation. Instead, he walked in calm, quiet, and observant. He studied everything, the guards, the routines, the weaknesses. To the warden he was inmate number 92168. To the underworld he was still the boss. Luciano knew that the real power of a leader wasn't measured by location, but by loyalty. Within weeks, he had re-established communication with the outside world. Lawyers carried coded messages. Bribed guards slipped notes into laundry bags. Visiting family members repeated subtle phrases, all carefully chosen signals. His empire hadn't vanished, it had simply gone underground. From his prison cell, Luciano transformed himself from a visible ruler to a ghost commander. His lieutenants, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and Joe Adonis, operated freely, guided by the strategic principles he'd laid down years before. Every decision, every deal, every truce still echoed his philosophy. Even behind bars, the network he built ran smoother than ever. The Mafia Commission, which Luciano himself had created, continued to function like a board of directors. Orders flowed, profits rose, and the organization stayed unified, all under the invisible influence of a man in a prison uniform. What made Luciano exceptional wasn't just his ability to control people, but his ability to delegate. He trusted his lieutenants to maintain order. He understood that empires built on fear alone collapsed the moment fear weakened. So he maintained a different kind of dominance, one built on respect, calculation, and the illusion that he could never truly be silenced. The guards noticed small changes in him. He was polite, punctual, even charming. He read newspapers every morning, studied English literature, and followed global events with the attention of a statesman. On the surface he was a model inmate. But beneath that calm he was plotting his redemption, not through escape but through relevance. By 1942 the world had shifted. America was at war. German submarines stalked the East Coast, sinking merchant ships. Panic spread through the harbors, and whispers of enemy sabotage began to circulate. The government needed help, but not the kind found in official offices. It needed someone who understood the docks, who controlled the unions, who could find answers where no lawman could reach. And that's when fate, or irony, intervened. Federal officials, desperate for information, quietly approached the very world they had spent years trying to destroy. Through intermediaries they contacted Meyer Lansky, who in turn reached out to Luciano. The idea was unthinkable, a secret wartime pact between the U.S. Navy and the American Mafia. From his prison cell, Luciano agreed to cooperate. He gave orders for his men to ensure the security of the docks, to eliminate spies, to guarantee smooth transport of war supplies. It was a covert alliance, unacknowledged, unofficial but effective. And it marked one of the most paradoxical chapters in American history, a government enlisting the help of its most infamous criminal to defend the nation. Inside Clinton prison, Luciano's demeanor changed subtly. He began receiving more visits, some from men in suits who weren't lawyers. Guards noticed that certain files disappeared from his records, that certain privileges were quietly granted. The other inmates watched in awe. How could a man behind bars hold more power than anyone walking free? Psychologically, this period reshaped Luciano. The man who had once been consumed by control now saw himself as something larger, a figure caught between two worlds, both criminal and patriotic. For the first time, he wasn't just manipulating the system. He was part of it. And though the arrangement would remain hidden for years, it laid the foundation for his eventual freedom. Dewey, the same man who had destroyed him, would one day be forced to acknowledge Luciano's usefulness to America's war effort. In the twilight quiet of his cell, Luciano would sometimes sit by the narrow window, cigarette glowing faintly in the dark. He'd think of the streets of New York, the sound of deals, the hum of life he once ruled. Yet he knew, in some twisted way, that he had achieved the ultimate irony. The United States government, in its hour of need, had turned to Lucky Luciano. Behind those prison walls, the boss was still in charge. Not of brothels or rackets, but of survival itself. The war ended, and with it came the quiet reshuffling of power, not just in the world but in Lucky Luciano's life. By 1945, the man once branded America's most notorious criminal had become an asset in secret government files. His cooperation during World War II, though never publicly admitted, had proven too valuable to ignore. Cargo flowed safely, sabotage ceased, and the Mafia's grip on the docks had served an unexpected purpose. And so, in the strange logic of history, the same system that had condemned him now prepared to release him. The decision came in early 1946. Thomas E. Dewey, now governor of New York, signed the order commuting Luciano's sentence, but on one condition: immediate deportation. It was a deal wrapped in irony. Dewey justified it as a recognition of war service, though the official documents were vague. Luciano's allies saw it as vindication, his enemies as humiliation. After 9 years behind bars, Lucky Luciano was free, but he could never again set foot on American soil. He stepped onto the pier that February morning surrounded by federal agents and reporters. Dressed in his finest suit, he looked calm, almost regal. But inside he knew the truth. America had given him everything: power, wealth, purpose, and now it was casting him out like a ghost. As he boarded the ship to Italy, Luciano turned once toward the New York skyline fading in the distance. "That city," he said quietly, "it belongs to me even if I can't touch it." His arrival in Naples was met with mixed emotions. To some, he was an exile, a man stripped of his empire. To others, he was a legend returning home. Italian officials watched him carefully, but in the alleys and cafes, whispers grew: "The American boss is back." Within weeks, Luciano's name was again being spoken in criminal circles, this time across Europe. Italy, however, was not the America he knew. The Mafia there, the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, operated with older traditions bound by blood, family, and silence. Luciano, ever the pragmatist, understood that his American business-style syndicate didn't easily translate here. So he adapted once more. He began forming new alliances, connecting Sicilian smugglers with American distributors, creating what would soon become the backbone of the post-war heroin trade. The so-called French Connection, the smuggling route that linked opium from the Middle East to labs in Marseille and then to the streets of New York, found one of its earliest architects in Luciano's post-exile network. Though he claimed to live quietly, he couldn't resist the pull of enterprise. The thrill of coordination, the pulse of power, it was in his blood. In Naples, he lived in a luxurious apartment overlooking the bay. Each morning, he drank espresso on the balcony, reading newspapers from America. He kept meticulous notes about the movements of his old associates: Costello's political influence, Genovese's ambitions, Lansky's growing empire in Havana. He remained connected, a quiet node in a global web of crime. But as the years passed, Luciano began to sense the hollowness of his freedom. Without New York, he was a king without a kingdom. The men he had once commanded now ruled their own fiefdoms. The commission he had built was stronger than ever, but it no longer needed him. He was the architect of a system that had outgrown its creator. Psychologically, exile took a slow toll. Luciano's charm and discipline remained, but beneath them brewed a deep loneliness. He would often walk the Neapolitan streets at dusk, unrecognized, anonymous. To the locals he was just another aging man in a fine suit. To history he was the ghost of an empire. In 1947 he attempted to reclaim some of his lost stature. Traveling through Sicily and Cuba, he sought to re-establish connections and perhaps even return to the United States indirectly. In Havana he met with Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, attending what would become known as the Havana Conference, a summit of underworld leaders that defined the future of organized crime. There, in smoky hotel rooms, plans were drawn for global expansion. Gambling in Havana, narcotics through Europe, money laundering through corporate fronts. For a brief moment, Luciano felt alive again. Surrounded by the old guard, men he'd built, men who still deferred to him, he believed he could reclaim his influence. But then came betrayal. Vito Genovese, ever the opportunist, tipped off U.S. authorities about Luciano's presence in Cuba. Under American pressure, the Cuban government expelled him. Once again, the invisible hand of politics reminded him that he was no longer untouchable. Back in Italy, surveillance intensified. The press followed his every move. American agents kept files, tracking rumors of drug trafficking in secret meetings. Luciano insisted he was retired. "I did my time, I paid my dues," he told reporters, but the whispers never stopped. The legend of Lucky Luciano had grown too large to ever fade. By the mid-1950s he was an old man by underworld standards. The men who had once feared him now ruled empires of their own. Lansky had built financial networks that reached into the Bahamas and Las Vegas. Costello wielded political influence as easily as a senator. Even Genovese, his longtime rival, had carved out his reign. Luciano watched from afar, proud and resentful in equal measure. There were rumors that he was writing memoirs, that he was negotiating film rights, that he was finally ready to tell the real story. But those close to him knew the truth. Luciano was haunted. Every empire he'd built had betrayed him in the end. The underworld, the government, even his own code of loyalty. And yet, in his later years he began to reflect differently. "Maybe I wasn't a bad man," he told a journalist in 1960. "I just played the game the way it was taught to me. Only difference is I didn't lose, I was removed." That line captures the paradox of Lucky Luciano, a man who saw himself not as a villain, but as a mirror of his time. A time when power was currency and morality a luxury. On January 26, 1962, Luciano met with a film producer at the Naples airport, supposedly to discuss a movie about his life. Moments after shaking hands, he suffered a massive heart attack and collapsed on the tarmac. He was dead before the ambulance arrived. When police searched his pockets, they found a cigarette case, a few coins, and a rosary. The man who had once controlled millions died alone, quietly looking toward the horizon, perhaps imagining the skyline of New York he could never return to. The following week, newspapers around the world ran his obituary. Some called him a criminal mastermind. Others, a visionary. But all agreed on one thing. Lucky Luciano had changed the face of organized crime forever. His exile had ended not in disgrace, but in a strange kind of immortality. He had outlived his enemies, outmaneuvered his myths, and left behind a system that still bore his fingerprints. In death as in life he remained what he always was, a man caught between two worlds, forever negotiating the price of power. When Lucky Luciano died, the world didn't just lose a gangster. It lost the man who had rewritten the very blueprint of organized crime. His death in 1962 marked the end of an era, yet the empire he designed kept breathing long after his heart stopped. The commission he founded still governed the underworld, and the structure he created continued to guide mob families across America. Even decades later, the Mafia's hierarchy, the rules, the rituals, the silent code, all carried Luciano's signature. His influence stretched far beyond the criminal world. He had turned the Mafia into something resembling a corporation, disciplined, profitable, and enduring. Every mob boss who followed, from Vito Genovese to Carlo Gambino, operated within the framework Luciano built. The U.S. government and the FBI studied his methods not just to dismantle them, but to understand how power could be controlled through organization and fear. But Luciano's legacy was not purely about structure, it was about psychology. He understood human nature in its rawest form, that people could be ruled not by love or loyalty but by leverage. He knew that fear, when paired with respect, could build an empire more stable than any dynasty of kings. To him, morality was an illusion, only results mattered. Today, historians call him the architect of modern organized crime. But perhaps his greatest creation wasn't the Mafia, it was the idea that power itself could be managed like a business. His life became a mirror reflecting the darker truths of ambition and control. Lucky Luciano may have died as a man, but his methods, his mindset, and his ghost still haunt every system built on secrecy and greed. Lucky Luciano's story ends not with a bang, but with silence. The kind of silence that only power and death can create. By the time he died in 1962, the empire he built had already outgrown him. The 5 families, the commission, and the rules he enforced became the backbone of organized crime for decades. His fingerprints lingered on every deal, every dollar, every whispered order that passed through New York's underworld. Yet his true legacy wasn't just criminal, it was structural. Luciano showed the world that even chaos could be managed, that power wasn't about violence alone but about order. He replaced blood feuds with boardroom meetings, turning gangsters into businessmen and the Mafia into a global enterprise. In doing so, he blurred the line between criminality and capitalism, between morality and ambition. History remembers him as both villain and visionary. To some, he was the devil who gave crime a business plan. To others, he was a genius who saw truth in a corrupt world, that loyalty could be bought and control could be absolute. His story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about power: who wields it, who fears it, and who hides behind its shadow. In the end, Lucky Luciano's greatest creation wasn't the Mafia. It was the idea that power, once organized, never truly dies. It only changes its face, from the alleyways of Manhattan to the glass towers of today. His ghost lingers there still, reminding us that every empire, legal or criminal, is built on the same foundation: ambition, silence, and the price of control.